Chris, we're definitely excited to have you. And for those of you that don't know, Chris just wrote this book, Forget the Alamo, and you can also look at it behind on his amazing uh, Zoom room. And we actually joked with Chris beforehand, asked Chris if Room Rater, the I guess the infamous or famous, whatever you want to call it, Twitter account, has actually rated his room. And Chris, what was the score that you got for that?
It was 9 out of 10.
9 out of 10. That's incredible. And do you think you've improved upon that since getting that score?
Well, he or she said they dinged me because I had a loose wire underneath my lamp, and so I've tamed that. And hopefully, if the Jory Reid show has me back on, I can maybe get a recount.
Well, I absolutely love it. And again, we mentioned your new book, Forget the Alamo. And so if you want a chance to win that book, we're going to be giving away a copy. And there's one simple rule that you have to follow. Just text Forget the Alamo to 713-360-0133. That's Forget the Alamo to 713-360-0133. And we'll notify the person via text message. We'll do like a random.org and send that person the book. So send us a text for your chance to win. But Chris, we're really excited to have you this month for a conversation, and we're going to focus on a few things here. And again, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So for those of you that are on the call, feel free to drop any questions in the chat box or in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those as we have the conversation. But just a roadmap of where we're going to go. We're going to talk about your career as a journalist, your new book, Forget the Alamo, and then we'll kind of close it off to censorship, delivering honest information. And within that, the theme will be how it impacts you as a communications professional. So kind of on to your background. You know, you've written commentary on business, energy, and economics for the Houston Chronicle since 2014. Prior to joining the Chronicle, you spent 20 years with the Associated Press covering politics, conflicts, economics in more than 30 countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. And you've been a two-time New York Times best-selling author, which is just absolutely incredible. Is there anything that I left off of your impressive credentials?
Well, I would just add I was a soldier for 7 years, and that's where I learned to work hard and be persistent. Thank you, Uncle Sam.
Well, thank you for your service. We definitely appreciate that. And I do want to spend a quick moment on your career. And so we mentioned that you spent 20 years with the Associated Press, and some of that was covering Afghanistan. And you were deployed there right after 9/11. You covered the Tora Bora in 2001. And what we're seeing unfold right now in Afghanistan is just awful. And especially with the news this morning with two massive explosions and numerous fatalities near the Kabul airport. And it's just horrifying to see it play out on social media. But I think it takes courage for journalists to be there on the ground and relay this information to the world and let them know what is going on. And I think it was courageous of you 20 years ago to be there in Afghanistan and be that wartime correspondent. So what was your experience like there in Afghanistan, and what did you learn from it?
Well, I went into Afghanistan shortly after, like the day after Kabul fell to the Northern Alliance. I was actually scheduled to fly in to Mazar-e-Sharif, and we didn't know Kabul was going to fall. I was geared up to spend the winter in the mountains and to be there for a spring offensive to move on Kabul. Kabul fell much quicker than anyone expected. The Taliban melted away. So when my chopper landed, I flew in with the Northern Alliance helicopter out of Tajikistan, drove directly to Kabul, and this was before we had embeds. In fact, the U.S. Special Forces were extremely hostile to journalists. If we encountered them, for instance, when we encountered them near Tora Bora, they actually shot at us, fired warning shots to chase us away. And so we were moving, what later became known as being a unilateral. I was quickly assigned from Kabul to go down to Jalalabad. We had heard, I was supposed to search the Al-Qaeda camps for any clues or evidence or stories. And it was there that I learned that bin Laden and many Al Qaeda fighters had retreated to Tora Bora. And that's, I embedded with the Mujahideen led by Hazrat Ali, and lived at the front lines while they fought their way up the mountain, and US troops accompanied them. And it was a different time. I think it was much more mission oriented. There was no nation building going on. I know the Mujahideen commanders that I met and spent time with did not expect the Americans to stick around very long. In fact, I met this one very old man with an M1 Garand rifle across his back who'd fought the Russians. He'd fought the Taliban. And he said, listen, if you guys stay too long, we're going to fight you too. We're a proud people. This is our country, and we're going to run it the way we want to. And I think that's a voice that I didn't really pay attention to. And it's one that the Americans have not paid attention to. And I think we see now for the umpteenth time, we learn the folly of being an occupation army in a culture that doesn't want us.
Yeah, it's incredible that it's been 20 years. The longest war that the U.S. has been a part of, breaking the Vietnam record, and it's just tragic how it's all played out. And what is something that you kind of learned from that experience that maybe you've carried into your career today? Maybe it wasn't in Afghanistan, maybe it was something just being traveling around to 30 countries. What is something that you've kind of learned from that worldly view of journalism?
Well, I mean, for 20 years and 9 wars and countless, that was my specialty, was covering conflicts, covering natural disasters. I covered the tsunami and earthquakes and volcanoes and hurricanes. One of the most important lessons is how resilient human beings are, and how most of us are actually fairly altruistic. I think there's a Darwinian argument to be made that we help each other out. That's the only way our species has made it this far, is through cooperation. But we tend to focus a little too much on the conflict. And, if only 2 or 3% of a population decides to pick up weapons, that can be, incredibly devastating. So I think we don't pay enough attention to the people who are trying to build their country, and we don't let them build their country. We tend to think that we can solve all of their problems with our troops and with our money and with our guns. And I hope, Clausewitz said, that war is politics by another means. If you don't have political solutions, you have endless wars. And we rely too much on our military and not enough on our diplomats and politicians to reach negotiated agreements. And every war that I've seen ended was the result of cooperation and negotiation, not from military might.
We'll kind of wrap up the conversation here on Afghanistan momentarily, but you've got an essay that's coming up, kind of on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Is there any insights that you can share on that, or maybe where our attendees can find that essay?
I'm still working on the essay. It's going to be on the front page on September 11th. And I think it's about what happens when arrogance and ignorance meet, and how humility and the golden rule are the two things that we're all taught, but we never follow.
Yeah, I think the golden rule is something that we should always follow. It's something that I think my mom ingrained into me when I was a little kid. But kind of shifting gears toward your career as a journalist, I had a conversation with John McClain a few years ago. And for those that don't know, John McClain covers the NFL for the Houston Chronicle. And we were talking about social media and podcast and how reporting has really changed. Like, no longer are you just, putting out 2 to 3 stories a week. You're active on a variety of channels daily. And, if news breaks at midnight, you're covering it. If it's 2 a.m., you're covering it. You're engaging with people on social media. And I've noticed that you kind of do the same thing, right? I mean, you're not just putting content out there on HoustonChronicle.com. I mean, you're constantly engaging people on Twitter. You're doing numerous interviews and webinars like this. And so if you look at kind of how your career has evolved and how the role of journalism has evolved, how do you think digital media has maybe changed the game for reporters?
Well, undoubtedly, it's boosted expectations. At the AP, we used to joke we have a deadline every minute because we were a 24-hour news. We served clients around the planet. We had 18,000 outlets around the world, and some newspaper somewhere was going to bed, and they needed the latest news. And I think all news organizations are wire services now. We have clients all over the world. Also, our business plan has changed. It's not enough to keep advertisers happy anymore. Newspapers were in the paper business. We sold pieces of paper that we promised to deliver to doorsteps where advertisers could display their products and services. The news was just a way to get people to buy that sheet of paper. The Houston Chronicle and the New York Times and all the big news organizations now understand that advertising is not our future. We are watching, our advertising revenues drop anywhere from 15 to 20% a year. What we need now are subscribers. We're now direct to customer. We're not business to business anymore. We need our subscribers to give us a monthly fee. And to get them to give us that fee, we have to give them a service that they think is valuable. And that means providing them information in the channels in which they live. My Twitter account or my Facebook or my LinkedIn are all part of a funnel to drive readers to my content. And if my content's good enough, they'll keep coming back. And if they want to come back more than 3 times in 6 weeks, they're going to have to pay for it. And I would say that we are, watching our subscriber levels shoot up. Now, they're not rising fast enough to make up for the loss of revenue in advertising. So we're having to make some adjustments. But if we can get to 100,000 digital-only subscribers, then that pays for the newsroom. It means that we don't have to worry about printing presses, and we don't have to worry. Any new print subscriptions that go out are gravy. And so to get that, though, we have to be engaging, and we have to engage all the time. And we have to develop an audience for our brand, our personal brands, as well as our newspaper's brand.
Has your mindset kind of shifted at all, from when you started your career to now? I mean, are you actively thinking about how you can engage your audience and potential readers, and how they can maybe, spread that information word of mouth or share those articles? Are you actively thinking about that when you write a story?
Yes, absolutely. I look at my metrics every day. I know how many people are reading my work online minute by minute. I know what stories do well. I know which ones do bad. I'm thinking about headlines. I'm a lousy headline writer. I need remedial education, because at the AP, we didn't really write headlines. We wrote information lines for editors to know what a story is about, not grab you by the neck and make you want to read it headlines, which is what digital media requires now. I've also made the shift from being part of the anonymous press to being, having my picture next to my work in the newspaper and online. So I also have to think about being a personality and being an entertainer, as well as being a journalist who informs people. And I think, unfortunately, that's where all news is going to go, because of that need to engage our customers. Our customers don't want to engage with a anonymous God voice that's providing commodity information. They're going to pay to read Chris Tomlinson and Erica Greeter and John McClain, and they're going to want that product in it. That's what they're going to pay for.
Yeah, we're seeing that people are actually stepping up and paying. I mean, New York Times has reported that over the last 18 months, their subscription rates have gone up. We see companies like The Athletic that are coming around in a subscription only model, and The Athletic doesn't have any advertising at all. That's what you pay for, is to remove the ads. I do want to give time for people to ask questions. So, if you've got any comments or questions, please drop them into the chat or the Q&A feature. But do you think, those models are the future for journalism moving forward, behind the paywall, or is there another way that maybe journalism can pivot to kind of toss away that notion of, newspapers are dead?
Well, I mean, the print newspaper, the print edition that you get at, I don't, to me, that's going to be a niche product. People will always want information. They'll always want valuable information. Two of the most read beat reporters last time I did a study on it were the real estate reporter and the traffic reporter. Those, and restaurants, right? Because this is information that people really value, and they're willing to pay for those things. My numbers don't anywhere near compete with those. So people want information, they need information. We have to teach them to pay for the information. I don't think there's going to be I think we're going to see more paywalls and stricter paywalls because no other model is working. The advertising is not going to pay for it.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how it's just evolved so quickly over the last decade or so. But we've got a lot of people on this webinar who are communications professionals who work in public relations and are trying to get in touch with reporters like you, maybe to cover stories or provide a source. When kind of, looking at the statistics, I think it's 3 PR people for every single journalist that's out there, some absurd number like that. And so there's a lot of noise that is out there I'm sure you get numerous pitches a day, but for comms and PR professionals, what is the best way to maybe build a relationship with a local journalist and maybe pitch stories, to get them covered for the clients?
Well, I think, the quickest way to get deleted out of my inbox is to show absolutely no knowledge of who I am and what I do. And, I get the generic emails that say, "Hey, Chris," in a different font. And then there's this standardized pitch. And they're just going to get deleted. I see no value in them. I think what I think PR people need to understand is that I know your duty is to your client. My duty is to my readers. And, I may like a PR person a lot, and I may think they've got a really interesting angle, and I write about it, and then my readers don't care. They're not clicking on that piece. And if they don't click, then I don't hit my quota. And if I don't hit my quota, then I get a talking to from my boss, right? Who's going to say, look at your metrics, look at what the readers want, and write what the readers want as a professional journalist. And the readers do want good stuff. My piece on Medicare on Monday has already hit, 50,000 clicks. It may end up being the most read thing I write this year, even after I had huge success writing about, the electric grid during the after the blackout. So they want news, and they want real news, but they want stuff that they can use. So if you're a PR person, know that I'm a columnist, know that I am paid to have an opinion. Make sure that your team is okay with my opinion, because I've had so many people back out once they realized that I was an opinion writer. And, and think about and just understand that I've got to find an angle that's going to excite readers, because that's my job. It's not to be a channel for you to make your client happy.
That's great advice. And again, if you have any comments, questions, drop them in the chat or the Q&A feature, and we'll pass them along to Chris. But Chris, I'm really excited that you took our pitch. And one of the reasons why we actually pitched you was because of your book, Forget the Alamo. And if you haven't picked it up, again, you have the opportunity to do so. Just text Forget the Alamo to 713-360-0133. That number is in the chat box. But I'm a sixth generation Texan. And for me, it was absolutely incredible to read. I think here in Texas, I believe we had Texas history in fourth grade, seventh grade. I think those were the 2 years that we had it. And the narrative from your book was a little bit different than what I remember learning in school. And to me, I think that's awesome. It's fascinating because history evolves, information changes, how it's reported is changed. And I think you do a really good job with your co-writers in researching, fact checking, and providing a great context on where we were, how we got here, and where we are now. And so when you kind of look back at the whole process of writing Forget the Alamo, what went into this, and why was it something that was important for you to tell that story?
Well, I kind of make myth busting one of my hobbies. And so my first book, Tomlinson Hill, was about my family's history as slaveholders and the myth of the good slaveholder, that there was such a thing. And it was a chance to look at two families, one white, one black, both with the Tomlinson name, from slave days to the current day. And my present day cousin is LaDainian Tomlinson, the retired football player who's now on the NFL Network. And we talk about those two families. That kind of set me up for Forget the Alamo, because I would bounce off different things about the Texas Revolution and the Battle of the Alamo, and I realized, whoa, that story is not the one that I learned in seventh grade history. And I also understood that, the demographics are changing. Texas is only 41% Anglo, non-Hispanic white. And this new majority is by predominantly people of color, and soon Hispanics will be the majority in Texas. And so my fundamental question was, and I wrote this in a column because my column also appears in the San Antonio Express News, is Texas must change its brand for a new population. This idea of honoring the white cowboy colonialist whose main purpose in life was enslaving African Americans and ethnically cleansing Mexican Americans, those heroes can't last. We have to learn new lessons and have a new perspective. And the Alamo, as the founding myth of Texas, was step one. Let's look at the Alamo. Why were those men at the Alamo? What were they fighting for? And they'll tell you, we were defending our property from the dictator Santa Anna. What they don't tell you is that the only property Santa Anna wanted to take away were the slaves. He wanted, Mexico was an abolitionist government. It was an abolitionist culture. They had tolerated slavery in Texas, and they wanted it to stop. And they had been trying to stop slavery in Texas for a decade. If you start there, then a lot of other stuff unravels. You realize that William Travis had his slave Joe at the battle. Jim Bowie was a notorious slave trader and killer of African Americans. And Davy Crockett was just a pompous, failed politician who was trying to get a new start at the age of 49 and got himself caught up in deeper water than he could swim in. And that's kind of where we start. But that's only the first third of the book. The middle third of the book is about, where did all these myths come from? Why were they invented? How did they serve white supremacy? And that was truly their purpose. And then the last third of the book is about the revisionism, the rise of Chicano historians, and this long battle to try to rectify the story that we learn in seventh grade history class. And so I like to say, we didn't break any new ground. all the history from that first third of the book has already been researched by others and published by professional historians. But the more important point is that Texas is changing and our perception of our history must change with it.
Why is it important to kind of keep that in mind, as we are maybe developing a marketing plan, or maybe we're developing communications or PR campaign, that we have to understand the demographics of Texas and this country are changing. And there's, a demand, especially when we look at like ESG, a lot of people are wanting, the social side of things to be included when making these pushes. Why is it kind of important to maybe recognize that, yeah, we've had our flaws, over the past 200-300 years, but we can do better? Why is it important for maybe to have that lens when you look at, communication activities?
Well, I mean, I think you're ultimately trying to make your customers happy, right? I mean, these corporations that you represent have customers of some sort, and they're trying to get more customers, trying to get more revenue. You're trying to do business. And if Hispanics are going to be more than 50% of the Texas population in 2025, then perhaps you should know that within Tejano families, for a dozen generations, they have told the story of the Alamo differently within their family. When I was at an event in San Antonio, the number of elderly Hispanic people who got up and said, "Thank you for telling the truth about the Alamo. This is the story that my abuela and my abuelo taught me. And it's the story that their abuelas and abuelos taught them. And thank you so much for, putting the true story out there, the one that I learned as a little kid at home instead of in 7th grade history class." When we were talking about how resentful Hispanic Tejanos, Mexican Americans were towards the Alamo and that mandated school field trip to visit the Alamo, not a single Anglo knew this. They did not realize the powerful resentment that so many Mexican Americans have towards that myth of the Texas Revolution. And we have an entire chapter dedicated in our book to bringing those voices forward and sharing them with a larger audience. So, do you really want your company's brand name across the front of the William B. Travis room of a new museum at the Alamo that's all about about the glory of slaveholders fighting to preserve slavery? You probably don't. That would probably be a bad look. If not now, definitely in 3 to 5 years from now. So yes, I think anytime you get involved with anything to do with history, you better make sure that you know the whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was in June, General Mark Milley, when he was giving an update on critical race theory, he was asked about that. He said something that really stuck out to me. It was, be open-minded and be widely read. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with everyone's position on items, but you have to know where they're coming from, and you have to maybe see how it can impact policy, how it can impact strategy moving forward.
Well, and I would just add, beware of Confederate race theory, which is, I want to keep my monuments to my ancestors who died fighting for the South in the Civil War, but whatever you do, let's not talk about slavery and racism. It's this idea that, we can somehow honor half of history. And the flip side of that, of course, is that the part that you're ignoring is the most important part of history for an African American or a Mexican American. And you're oppressing their stories when you ignore that half of the Confederate race theory.
Very interesting perspective. And I think your book has maybe raised a few eyebrows on Congress Avenue in Austin, and maybe specifically at the Bullock Museum. And I think probably most of our attendees are aware of what happened, but maybe give us some insights into your event that was supposed to take place at the Bullock Museum. why it was canceled, and kind of the attention that I guess was elevated because of that.
Well, we were getting a lot of invitations to speak before the book even came out. And the book was had reached out to us in March with a formal request, and it was one of dozens. And of course, there's only so much time in that first month that a book comes out. One of the other requests had come from the Writers League of Texas, and we thought, well, let's package these two things together. We'll do a book museum sponsored event. Writers League of Texas will moderate, and we'll do it a couple of weeks after the book launches to give people a chance to read it. And the idea was we were going to talk about writing the book and writing history. And let's be clear, we're making an argument here. We're not offering a textbook. This is a point of view, and we think we have the facts to back up our point of view, but it's still, we're not pretending to be textbook authors here. Months go by, we're getting closer to the event. We're advertising it. The Bullock's got over 300 people signed up for it. It's going to be virtual using the Bullock's website. And then Texas Public Policy Foundation and their executive director puts out a tweet saying, I call on the State Preservation Board to intervene and cancel this event at the Bullock, because the Preservation Board oversees the Bullock. And these purveyors of critical race theory and a 1619 project version of history should not be allowed to speak at a Texas institution. That was Tuesday. On Wednesday, we have a conversation with the Bullock. They go, oh, no problem. We have controversial authors all the time. We're going to go through with it. It's fine. Then about 3 hours before, I get a text message while I'm driving from Houston to Austin saying the Bullock's pulled out. And it came from the Writers League because the Bullock just cut all communications with us. They didn't talk to us. They didn't return our calls, didn't return our emails, just went radio silent and sent the message through the Writers League. Writers League offered to do a Zoom on their channel, but there was no way to get 300 people transferred over. And we really weren't sure what was going on. I made a phone call, found out the politicians were involved. I did a Twitter thread that went viral. And the next day, Dan Patrick goes on Twitter himself to say, yes, I canceled the event. I used my power as lieutenant governor to silence US citizens in the great state of Texas, which is a clear violation of our First Amendment rights.
We'll get into that in just a moment, but Jamie has a question in the comments. And Jamie, this is a great point. You asked, I would wager that not everyone on the Zoom knows the history of the Alamo. We do have a lot of people in here that aren't from Texas, so I don't think you learn, Texas history in maybe California or New York. So maybe that's an error on my part for not setting that up. But can you maybe give us some insights into the myth of the Alamo, Chris, and what the truth turned out to be?
Sure. So the myth goes that in a fight for liberty against a vicious dictator from Mexico, white settlers in Mexico, because Texas was part of Mexico at the time, were fighting for their liberty. And a group of them massed at the Alamo to hold San Antonio. Even though huge numbers of Mexican troops arrived, these 200 or so men decided to sacrifice themselves to slow down the Mexican army, so that Sam Houston, around what is now Houston, could get his troops together and get trained and prepare to take the Mexican army on. After 13 days of siege, they die to a man fighting in defense of the Alamo, but killing hundreds of Mexican soldiers with them. And that this was that this was why Sam Houston was later able to defeat the Mexican army at San Jacinto. First thing I would say is Sam Houston had ordered the troops at the Alamo to destroy it, abandon it, and retreat and join his forces, because he couldn't sacrifice a single man. There was no order given to slow down the Mexican army. In fact, Travis ignored warnings from his Mexican-American allies that the troops were coming. He did not retreat. He was trapped. He found himself encircled by the Mexican cavalry and had nowhere to go. The Mexican army did demand that he surrender without condition, which meant that they would probably be executed as pirates and rebels if they had surrendered. So they didn't, and they did, after 13 days, fight to the death. Though about 2/3 of them did try to make a run for it and were hunted down by the cavalry in the fields around the Alamo. So this idea that they fought to the death inside the chapel, that's a complete lie. Also, the Mexican army remained on schedule. 2 days later, the rest of the Mexican army arrived, and as planned, Santa Anna set off to pursue Sam Houston's army. So there was really no logistical slowdown. The battle served no strategic or tactical purpose, and was really just a blunder. But that's not the story we're taught.
And Dan Patrick, as you mentioned, and other leaders in the state of Texas took issue with the story that you told and that your co-writers told. And that's where, the shutdown at the Bullock Museum happened. But if I'm maybe thinking from a PR perspective, I think that was almost, while I definitely do not support suppressing First Amendment rights, that was probably the best thing that could have happened from a public relations standpoint for you and for the book, is because it brought a lot of national notoriety as a result of that. Am I fair in kind of maybe making that assumption?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. We had received glowing reviews in the Wall Street Journal,
right,
in the New York Times, in the Washington Post. We had already, Brian, my co-author, had already been on Fresh Air. We were doing very well, thank you very much. I mean, we were selling books, and our publisher was happy. And I guess I take your point that I was invited on the Joy Reid show because I was canceled, because my First Amendment rights were violated. But I want to caution about giggling too much about this, because this is part of an increasing authoritarianism that we're seeing from state leaders, from Greg Abbott's attempts to basically deny local politicians any local control over their communities on anything from plastic garbage bags up to mask mandates in public schools. We're seeing the railroading of the opposition in voting rights in the legislature this week. In Rwanda, rebels put $1,000 price on my head because they did not like what I was saying on Voice of America about their war. I was beaten bloody by a Zairian colonel for my reporting about his troops raping refugees en masse outside Goma, Zaire. So for me, I sold a few more books, but let's not giggle about this. This is still an oppressive authoritarian action by one of our most powerful politicians in Texas. And I think we just laugh about it way too much, and we don't take it seriously enough.
It's a very, very good perspective. And I think that gives me a different look inside of this perspective. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe there is litigation that is going on, or a lawsuit that was filed.
We have not filed a lawsuit. Our attorneys have written a letter, and we're awaiting a reply from the Lieutenant Governor and the Bullock. We have not received one yet, and we're still kind of weighing our options. It's a federal lawsuit is a big project,
right?
And so we have to make sure we have our ducks in a row.
What is maybe something that you learned from this process, and maybe what is something that communications professionals can learn from this on why it is absolutely important to protect the First Amendment?
Well, I mean, it this can go these this can go even further, right? I mean, you can find yourself. Let's take a flip side. Let's say you do want to sponsor the William Barrett Travis room in a new Alamo museum that talks about the glory of the Texas Revolution. Let's say you buy into that traditionalist viewpoint, and there's a liberal governor who says, "Oh no, you can't do that. We can't have that taught here." And I don't care. Texas Corporation. I'm not going to name one because I'll just get in trouble. I don't want you doing that. And if you do that, then you're going to have trouble from me. I'm going to, it's Donald Trump running around denouncing corporations for their speaking out for Black Lives Matter or for talking about climate change. Do you really want politicians involved or commenting or offering commentary or condemnation of your communications speech? We've seen it. We've seen it happen. We've seen Greg Abbott tell corporations to shut the hell up and stop talking about things they don't understand around voting rights. This can get a lot worse for corporations and communications professionals. And if you don't think it can, well, I mean, I've spoken at the Bullet twice before. No problems. And then one day it was.
It's going to be fascinating to follow, and I'm sure we definitely haven't heard the last of this. And I think that one of the things that I've been concerned about is misinformation, disinformation, whatever you want to call it. It's not anything new. I mean, it's propaganda that has been around hundreds of years, and it's not going away anytime soon. I mean, it's whether people want to admit it or not, propaganda does work, and that's, I think, incredibly disappointing. But within IABC, we've got a code of ethics. That we tell the truth, that we focus on that we focus on correct and accurate information. So whether you're a communications professional or a journalist, how do you cut through that noise of misinformation to get your message, the accurate message, out there? Or maybe even to correct that misinformation?
Well, I think a lot of misinformation and disinformation comes from demagogues. And I can't think of the title. It's on my shelf over here. There's a great book about demagoguery and the neuroscience of demagoguery. And one of the things you can't do is, if you're an outsider, you can't tell someone inside a group not to believe their leader. They're never going to listen to you, right? So I don't try to change the minds of people who already consider me an outsider, not one of them. But I can try to tell entertaining stories based on facts that will engage readers and provide a narrative that helps them understand their world better in a way that makes sense to them. You can defeat people with facts and logic and narrative. And that's what I try to do. I find it to be fairly effective. But it's all the things you learn as a writer. It's about framing, narrative, building your case, showing your evidence, and telling a story that people will internally feel is authentic. The authenticity is what people are attracted to. Even among the demagogues, they love their demagogues because they feel authentic.
Yeah. We've got about 14 minutes left of the webinar, and we've got a few people who submitted questions via email that we'll get to here shortly. But if you have any comments or questions, again, please feel free to drop them in the chat box or the Q&A feature. And again, you've got just a few minutes left to enter. for a chance to win Chris's book, Forget the Alamo. So just text Forget the Alamo to 713-360-0133. I checked a few moments ago, and as of now, Andrew, Carol, Tim, and Becky are in the running. So we will announce who that winner is at the end of the session. So you've still got a few minutes left to get your information in there. But Chris, one of the questions that we had is, in communications, we're often collaborating with team leaders, clients, or other communicators within our own team. And we all have our own style, our own strengths, and our own weaknesses. When you're co-writing a book with two different authors, how do you balance the multiple styles?
Well, I mean, we didn't. I mean, is the short answer in terms of writing style. Brian has been with Penguin for a long time. Penguin wanted Brian Burroughs' voice. And so we knew that there was going to be a Brian Burroughs sheen across the entire book. But what we did, though, is, we divided up into the three sections. It's a play in three acts. Brian did the history, I did the mythology, and Jason did the present day. And then when we found out about the Phil Collins collection, Brian and I teamed up because we were both trained investigative reporters, and we knew how to do that. And Jason had less experience in that area. And we each kind of wrote a first draft of each section, shared it with one another, argued a lot about what to leave in, what to cut out. The book was a third too long in its first draft, so we had to cut it by a third to get it to the length Penguin wanted it. And there was lots of arguments about what to keep and what to stay in. But then ultimately, Brian did his pass over the top in his style. I did an edit, then he does a revision, and that's what Penguin took. It was brutal, horrible work, and I wouldn't ever do it again. But, which makes me admire that you folks that work in teams every day. God bless you.
Got a few comments that came in the chat, but we've got another question that came via email. How do you balance your personal brand with, whether it's the Twitter accounts or the publications like Forget the Alamo versus your obligations and day-to-day role at the Chronicle?
Well, I mean, they're one and the same at this point. I discussed with the executive editor this book before I signed the contract. As long as I'm a full-time staff employee at the Chronicle, they own all of my columns. Books do not pay well enough. Even the New York Times bestsellers do not pay well enough for me to quit my job. So I have to balance the two. I'm lucky in that I am a columnist. I'm one of the few people at the Chronicle allowed to voice an opinion on social media, even encouraged to do that. But I have to stay within the guidelines in our Code of Ethics and social media guidelines. So yeah, I would say that there's really no difference between the two at this point.
That's good. It's good when you always have a business that supports, different ventures, whether
Yes.
it's a podcast or a hobby or something like that. It's always good.
Oh, well,
that
they
support.
love it. They love it when I get hit with the Houston Chronicle tag when I'm on national media. No, it looks good for them.
Yeah, when you look good, they look good. So that definitely matters. Sarat had a comment. What is the future of community newspapers? Some are adapting to a nonprofit model. Will the big ones follow suit?
Well, community newspapers inside my industry is that's like your weekly coupon-driven neighborhood paper for, Bel Air or, one of the suburbs. We refer to papers like the Dallas Morning News, Houston Chronicle, San Antonio Express News as metros. And the metros, I think, will always be for profit. And there's the nonprofit model, I think, only works for niche publications. I think if you're ProPublica and you're doing investigations, or you're Texas Tribune covering the legislature, or you're the Marshall Project covering criminal justice, you have a built-in donor base who cares about that issue and wants coverage of those topics. We're a general assignment paper. We cover everything from high school football to the NFL to oil and gas to criminal justice. I mean, we cover the whole gamut. We don't have a built-in donor base that cares about Metro Daily News. And frankly, I'm not a fan of nonprofits. I think we have to earn our way. I think we need, making a handful of major donors happy, to me, is not great journalism. Great journalism comes from giving the community news they can use and that they find valuable. And I hold a very high opinion of our readers. I think they want real news. They want serious writing. And they reward us for it. I mean, the metrics demonstrate that. So I like being for profit. I like relying on subscriptions because it makes us work harder and do better.
Definitely not sponsored by the Houston Chronicle, but I would definitely encourage you guys, if you don't already subscribe, at least subscribe to the digital subscription for the Chronicle. I think it's what, $4.99 or $6.99 a month, somewhere in that range.
I think we got like a 99-cent special going on right now. So,
but it's great. I mean, you can go through and you can click which newsletters you want sent to you, and it's something that I read. I get it at 3:14 every afternoon, and something that I always make sure to go through and read. And I share a lot of those news articles with colleagues. It could be relevant to their day-to-day job. Maybe we're passing it along to a client. So whether it's a local newspaper, I definitely recommend that you subscribe and even pay to support your local newspaper, and then also a few national publications as well, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, New York Times, The Economist, something like that. That's my recommendation. Take it or leave it if you want. But Tim put in the chat, "Hey Chris, font change, kidding. Great to hear you speak. Fantastic insight into the critical importance of the First Amendment and working to fight disinformation. Thank you, and thank you for what you do, Tim Raymond." And Becky Myers just added a comment. "As a former print journalist, I wholeheartedly agree with your assessment, Chris. Local newspapers matter. Absolutely. Journalism does matter, and that's why it's so important to protect the First Amendment." And, kudos to you, Chris, for all you've done in your career, and especially the courage that you displayed, as a wartime correspondent. I think that's incredibly important, and it's fun to be able to follow you on social media and see the work that you're doing, not only in the Chronicle but outside of it. And we couldn't be more excited to have you on the IABC Houston webinar this week.
Oh, thank you, Austin. I'm honored to be invited. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well.
And thanks for buying the book.
Yeah, we're going to do two things before we wrap up. So we had 5 people submit to our text number. And our text number, we were not going to spam you. This is something that IABC Houston does. We send out maybe 1 to 2 texts a month, just kind of alerting you of events that we have going on. But I'm going to share my screen right now. We're going to do random.org. And got random.org up. And so I put the 5 names in here. We've got Andrew Van Chow, Carol Miner, Tim Raymond, Becky Myers, and Tracy Torma. Chris, can you give me a number of between 1 and 5?
3.
All right. So we are going to randomize this 3 times, and whoever's name is at the top, I'll text you back through community, and we'll get your address and send it out on today. So 3 times. So 1. All right. 2. 3, and it's back where it started. Andrew Van Chow. Andrew, we'll get your address and send it over to you shortly. So we appreciate everyone for joining us. And Chris, for those that maybe want to follow the work that you're doing, maybe they want to purchase the book or subscribe to the Chronicle, how can they get in touch with you? And I guess.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm on Twitter at CL Tomlinson, Charlie Lima Tomlinson. My email is at the end of every column I write, chris.tomlinson@chron.com. And I'd love to hear from you.
Just make sure when you're emailing him not to italicize his name for a standard template. But Chris, we really appreciate it. And thank you again to everyone who joined us for this webinar. And again, make sure to follow him on social media, check out his book, Forget the Alamo, and also subscribe to the Houston Chronicle and support the work that he does, as well as other amazing and talented reporters at the Chronicle. So on behalf of IABC Houston and our guests this month, Chris Tomlinson, and our president, Lauren Williams, my name's Austin Stadden, and we'll see you in September. Stay safe, everyone.